They closed the door behind me like I was garbage, and then went on to live the life we all swore we'd share. If you ever felt tossed aside and told to be grateful, listen up. This is how that gratitude curdles into fuel. I'm gonna tell you the secret letters, the holiday photos I never made, and the single phone call that changed everything. Stick around. This one ends in a lie you won't see coming. They said I was difficult. That was the word they used, the one that stuck to me like tar. Difficult. They said it would be better this way, for everyone. They kissed my forehead, one after the other, their lips cool against my skin. My mother's eyes were wet, but she didn't cry. My father's jaw was set like stone. I didn't cry either. I just turned my back, dragged my suitcase down the 3 concrete steps of the porch, and I never saw that house again. Has anyone ever been told to leave like it's no big deal? Like you're a problem to be solved, a package to be delivered somewhere else? Tell me your story in the comments. I need to know I'm not the only one. Before the door slammed shut, there were promises. Our life wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and it was held together by these small, sacred vows we made to each other, usually over a steaming bowl of my mother's beef stew. The smell of it is still the closest thing I have to a memory of home. Onions and thyme, slow-cooked beef, the scent clinging to the yellow floral wallpaper in the kitchen. That kitchen was the heart of our world. It was where we did homework, where my older brother James would boast about his wins on the baseball field, and where my little sister Chloe would draw fantastical creatures on napkins. I remember the clink of forks against ceramic plates, a sound that meant safety. I remember my father's booming laugh when James told a stupid joke, a sound that filled the whole house. He worked in construction back then, and his hands were always rough and calloused, but he'd use them to ruffle my hair so gently it felt like a whisper. My mother was the quiet center. She hummed while she cooked, a low, steady tune that promised everything was all right. We swore we'd always be together. We swore we'd protect each other. On summer nights, sitting on the porch swing, James, Chloe, and I would make plans for the future. We'd live in houses next door to each other, our kids would be best friends, we'd have Sunday dinners every single week for the rest of our lives. They were the kind of promises only kids can make, full of certainty and blind faith. But then the cracks started to show. They were small at first, hairline fractures in the foundation of our lives. My father lost his job. The construction firm went under. And suddenly, his booming laugh was replaced by a heavy, anxious silence. The whispered arguments started after we were in bed. Words like foreclosure and debt drifted through the thin walls, sharp and ugly. My mother stopped humming. She started working double shifts at the diner, coming home with tired eyes and the smell of stale coffee clinging to her uniform. The community we lived in was small, the kind of place where everyone knows your business. The gossip followed us like a shadow. I'd hear it at the grocery store, whispers behind cupped hands. I saw the pity in our neighbors' eyes. That's when the labels started. I wasn't a quiet child. I asked questions. When my father started drinking more, his temper shortening, I asked why. When my mother would cry silently over the sink, I would ask what was wrong. When they told us we couldn't go to the summer camp we went to every year, I asked why James still got new baseball cleats. My questions weren't meant to be defiant. They were born of fear. I was trying to understand why our world was tilting off its axis. But to them, in their stress and their shame, my questions sounded like accusations. My sensitivity was seen as a weakness. James learned to be quiet, to be the easy one, the golden boy who never caused a problem. Chloe was too young to understand, retreating into her world of drawings. I was the one in the middle, the difficult one, the one who wouldn't just let things be. The love was still there, but it was tangled up with betrayal. I trusted them to keep us safe, to keep their promises, but they were drowning, and I was just another weight pulling them under. The turning point came on a Tuesday afternoon. I came home from school to find a man in a cheap suit sitting at our kitchen table, Mr. Harris. He had a thin, unsmiling mouth and eyes that seemed to see right through you. My parents were there, their faces pale and strained. There were papers on the table, important-looking papers with letterheads and signature lines. I heard my mother say my name in a choked whisper. My father just stared at the papers, his knuckles white as he gripped a pen. He signed his name with a harsh, scratching sound that felt like it was tearing something inside me. They were making the decision. They were signing me away. That night, my mother told me I was going to live with Mr. Harris for a while. She said he had a nice house in another town, a bigger room just for me, that it would be an adventure. She said it was because things were hard right now, and they needed to get back on their feet. She said it was for the best. Her voice was steady, rehearsed, like a line she'd been practicing all day. She didn't look me in the eye. I packed my suitcase in a daze. My favorite books, a worn-out stuffed bear, the few clothes that still fit. I felt a numb sort of shock, a disbelief that this was actually happening. It didn't feel real. As I was zipping up the bag, I saw a piece of folded notebook paper slide under my bedroom door. I knew it was from Chloe. I could see the little unicorn sticker she'd put on the corner. I picked it up, my fingers trembling. For a second, I wanted to open it, to read her childish scrawl, to hold on to that last piece of my old life. But a hot, bitter anger surged through me. It was so strong, it almost made me dizzy. A promise had been broken, the biggest promise of all. In that moment, I hated them all. I hated my parents for their lies, I hated James for being perfect, and I hated Chloe for her unicorn sticker and her silent complicity. I shoved the unopened note deep into the pocket of my jeans and walked out of the room without looking back. I never read it. Mr. Harris's car smelled of pine air freshener and old vinyl. The 3-hour drive was silent. I watched my town, my school, and everything I knew shrink and disappear in the rearview mirror until it was just an anonymous stretch of highway under a gray sky. His house was exactly as my mother had described it. Nice. It was a 2-story colonial with a manicured lawn and glossy black shutters. Inside, the floors were polished hardwood, the furniture looked like it was from a catalog, and there were no photos on the walls. Not a single one. It wasn't a home, it was a showroom. My room was upstairs. It was twice the size of my old one, with a big window overlooking a quiet, tree-lined street. There was a brand new desk, a bookshelf filled with books no one had ever read, and a bed with a stiff, floral comforter. My mother was right. It was nicer. But as Mr. Harris closed the door behind him, leaving me alone in that perfectly arranged, sterile room, a wave of loneliness so profound hit me that I had to sit on the floor just to breathe. He wasn't cruel, Mr. Harris. He was just absent. He gave me a laminated sheet of rules on my first day. Meals at 7 a.m., 12 p.m., and 6 p.m. sharp. No television on school nights. All homework to be completed before dinner. Curfew at 8 p.m. It was a list of regulations, not a welcome. He spoke to me in short, direct sentences, asking if my chores were done, if my grades were acceptable. There was no warmth, no conversation, just a quiet, oppressive order. They had given me a room with a bed, but they hadn't given me a promise. There was no promise of when I could come home, no promise of phone calls, no promise of a future that included me. The first night was the worst. I lay in that strange bed, the sheets smelling of bleach and starch instead of the familiar lavender scent of my mother's detergent. I listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling, the groan of the pipes, the hum of the refrigerator. Every noise reminded me that I was a stranger here. I buried my face in my pillow and cried until my throat was raw, silent sobs that shook my whole body. I was 10 years old and utterly, completely alone. My 11th birthday came and went a few months later. I got a card in the mail from my parents. It had a generic cartoon animal on the front, and inside it just said, "Happy birthday, love, Mom and Dad." There was a $20 bill tucked inside. No call, no visit, just a piece of paper and some money. like I was an obligation they could handle from a distance. The real torture came in glossy 4x6 prints. My mother, bless her heart, was a diligent record keeper. About once a season, a thick manila envelope would arrive. Inside were school photos, holiday pictures, snapshots from family vacations I was never invited on. I'd spread them out on my bed, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. There was James, grinning in his football uniform, his arms slung around my father. There was Chloe at the beach, building a sandcastle with my mother, their faces bright with sun and happiness. Thanksgiving dinner, Christmas morning, summer barbecues. A perfect, smiling family of 4. It was like they had just snipped me out of the frame, and the picture looked even better without me. I was a ghost in my own family's history, watching them live the life that was supposed to be mine. The turning point came one cold afternoon in October. I was 12. An envelope arrived, and inside was a postcard. On the front was a tacky-looking party hall decorated with pink and silver balloons. On the back, in my mother's neat cursive, it said, "Thinking of you. Chloe's Sweet 16 was a huge success. She wished you were here." Chloe's Sweet 16. We had planned that party for years. We'd picked out the theme, the colors, the songs we were going to dance to. They had promised me I'd be home for it. I was supposed to be her maid of honor, or whatever the Sweet 16 equivalent was. I stared at the photo on the front, at the blurry figures dancing under the cheap disco ball. They were all there. My parents, James, my cousins, my aunts and uncles, everyone, living and laughing and celebrating without me. For the first time, the deep, aching sadness I'd been carrying for 2 years curdled into something else, something hot and sharp. It was pure, unadulterated resentment. They hadn't just sent me away, they had replaced me. They had moved on so easily, so completely, that they could send me a postcard from the seam of their betrayal and not even realize what they were doing. I dropped the postcard on my desk. It landed face up, the smiling, dancing figures mocking me. I grabbed a piece of paper and a pen. I was going to write back. I was going to tell them exactly what I thought of their perfect life, their broken promises, their casual cruelty. The words poured out of me, angry and jagged. I filled the page with every ounce of hurt and rage I had stored up for 2 years. My hands were shaking when I was done. I folded the letter, shoved it into an envelope, and wrote my old address on the front. It was a declaration of war. I left it on my desk, planning to sneak out and mail it in the morning. But when I came back from the bathroom, the letter was gone. Mr. Harris was standing by the door, his face impassive. In his hands were the torn pieces of my letter. He dropped them into the wastebasket. "We don't write things like that," he said, his voice flat and final. "It only causes trouble. You should be grateful for what you have here." He walked out and closed the door, leaving me standing there with the silence and the shredded remains of my voice. Someone had just ripped up the only real thing I had felt in years, and in that moment, I knew I wasn't just a guest in this house. I was a prisoner. After the incident with the letter, I learned the rules of survival in Mr. Harris's house. Rule number 1, emotion is a liability. Rule number 2, invisibility is a shield. I became a model resident. My bed was made every morning with military precision. My chores were done without complaint. I learned the precise way he wanted the silverware polished, the exact angle at which the books on the shelves had to be aligned. My grades at school were impeccable. I became quiet, observant, and ruthlessly efficient. I kept my head down and my fists clenched, but only in my pockets where no one could see them. Externally, I was compliant. Internally, I was plotting my escape. Not a physical escape. I was smart enough to know that was impossible. It was an escape of the mind. I counted the days, then the weeks, then the years until I would be 18. 6 years, 3 months, 12 days. 4 years, 8 months, 2 days. I became a master of living inside my own head. My imagination was my only true freedom. I would spend hours in my room, staring out the window, creating elaborate futures for myself, where I was a famous writer, or a world traveler, or an astronaut. Anything that was a million miles away from that silent, polished house. My small rebellions were my lifeline. I found an old, half-broken radio in a dumpster behind the school and smuggled it home in my backpack. Late at night, huddled under my covers with the volume turned down so low I had to press my ear against the speaker, I'd listen to rock music from a distant city. The fuzzy guitars and defiant lyrics were a secret language of freedom. They were proof that another world existed outside my small, controlled existence. And then there was Tony. I met him in my freshman year of high school. He sat behind me in biology, a lanky kid with a sarcastic grin and ink stains on his fingers. He was the first person in years who looked at me and didn't see a sad story or a quiet, weird girl. He just saw me. We started talking, first about class, then about music, then about everything. We'd meet behind the bleachers during lunch, sharing headphones and complaining about our lives. His parents were divorced and always fighting. My family had vanished. We were two lonely kids who found a refuge in each other. He was my one secret, my one connection to a normal teenage life, and I guarded our friendship fiercely. The real shift, the first tiny seed of a different future, was planted by my English teacher, Miss Albright. She was a woman with kind eyes and a passion for literature that was infectious. She saw something in my writing, in the dark, coiled-up stories I would turn in for assignments. She saw the anger and the loneliness I poured onto the page and called it talent. "You have a voice, Maya," she told me one afternoon, holding one of my essays in her hand. "A powerful one. You shouldn't be afraid to use it." She encouraged me to enter the district's annual writing competition. The theme was home. I almost laughed. What did I know about home? But I wrote. I wrote about the ghost of a kitchen that smelled like beef stew. I wrote about promises that taste like ash in your mouth. I wrote about a house that was perfectly clean and perfectly empty. I didn't write it for the competition. I wrote it for me. I poured all the ripped-up letters, all the unsent words, all the silent screams onto 3 single-spaced pages. I titled it The Laminated Sheet. I didn't expect to win. I didn't even expect a place. So when they called my name for first prize at the school assembly, I was in shock. I walked up to the stage in a daze, my heart pounding in my chest. The principal handed me a small bronze plaque. It felt heavy and real in my hands. It was the first time in my life I had ever been recognized for anything. As I walked back to my seat, the applause sounding distant and strange, I did something stupid. I let myself hope. I scanned the small crowd of parents in the back of the auditorium, my eyes searching for a familiar face. For a fraction of a second, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, they had heard about the competition, that maybe they would show up for me. But there was no one, just a sea of strangers' faces, and, in the back row, one empty folding chair. The plaque suddenly felt cold in my hands. I had won. I had a voice, but there was no one from my family there to hear it. The years between 15 and 21 passed in a blur of schoolwork, secret radio sessions, and conversations with Tony. I got a part-time job at the local library, the quiet stacks of books a comfort. The money I earned went into a secret bank account, my escape fund. Mr. Harris seemed content to let me be, as long as I followed the rules and didn't cause any trouble. The envelopes from my mother still arrived, less frequently now, filled with glossy photos of a life I was no longer even pretending to be a part of. James was at a state university, a star on the debate team. Chloe was a cheerleader, her smile wide and bright in every picture. They looked happy, perfect. I had built a fortress around my heart, brick by painful brick. My righteous anger was my shield. They were the perfect family who had thrown me away. I was the survivor who would one day prove them wrong. It was a simple, clean narrative. It was the story that got me out of bed every morning. And then, a letter arrived that took a sledgehammer to the whole thing. I was a sophomore in community college, living in a tiny apartment above a laundromat that always smelled of damp clothes and dryer sheets. It had been almost a year since I'd gotten anything from home. I assumed they'd finally forgotten me completely. But there it was in my mailbox, a thin, white envelope with my name written in a familiar, looping script. It was from Chloe. My first instinct was to throw it away, but curiosity, that old nagging weakness, won out. I sat on my lumpy sofa and tore it open. The letter wasn't like my mother's cheerful, sterile updates. It was messy. There were tear stains blurring the ink in places, words crossed out and rewritten. It started with an apology. "I'm so sorry, Maya. I should have written sooner. I should have done something." She wrote about her life, but it wasn't the life from the photographs. She wrote about a crushing pressure to be perfect, to make up for… she didn't say what. She wrote about James, not the golden boy from the debate team, but a young man who was struggling, getting into trouble, dropping classes. She mentioned Dad's drinking, how it had gotten worse, how he and James were always fighting, shouting matches that shook the whole house. She wrote about Mom, walking on eggshells, her smile a brittle mask she put on for the world. The line that cracked my whole worldview wide open was near the end. She wrote, "Mom says we have to keep up appearances, especially because of what Mr. Harris did for us. She says we owe him. I don't understand it all, but it feels wrong. It feels like we're all living a lie." I read the letter 3 times. Owe him? What Mr. Harris did for us? It wasn't a rescue. It wasn't a favor. It was a debt. My carefully constructed narrative of them having it all while I suffered crumbled. The righteous anger I had nurtured for a decade was suddenly complicated by a deep, aching sorrow. Turns out, the grass they walked on had cracks in it too. Big, ugly cracks they'd been papering over with smiles and photographs. This was the turning point, the big reveal. My departure wasn't about me being difficult. It was a transaction. I had been used as collateral. My father, in his desperation, must have owed Mr. Harris money, or something even worse. Sending me to live with him, to be his ward, his responsibility, it was a payment. My childhood had been the price they paid to keep their secrets buried, to maintain the facade of their perfect suburban life. Someone had deliberately blocked my visits, censored my letters, and kept me away, not because I was a problem, but because my presence would have been a reminder of the dirty deal they had made. My hands were shaking. I needed to hear it from them. I needed to hear the lie from their own mouths. I dug out my old address book, my fingers tracing over the number I hadn't dialed in over a decade. My heart hammered against my ribs as I punched in the numbers. It rang once, twice. On the 3rd ring, someone picked up. There was no hello, just silence. I could hear the faint sound of a television in the background. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Mom?" There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. I heard a muffled sound, like a hand being clapped over the receiver. Then, a voice, not my mother's, but a man's, hissed, "Don't say anything." Then, click. The line went dead. They had hung up on me. But who? Was it my father, silencing my mother? Or was it James, the golden boy with secrets, making sure the past stayed buried? The dial tone buzzed in my ear, a sound that felt more final than any slammed door ever had. That single, disconnected phone call changed everything. The silence on the other end wasn't just an absence of words. It was an act of aggression. It was a confirmation. They were hiding something, and they were willing to hang up on their long-lost daughter to protect it. The sorrow I'd felt after reading Chloe's letter was burned away by a cold, clear resolve. I was done watching their life from the sidelines. I was done being a ghost. I was going to go home. It took me another 2 years to get my ducks in a row. I finished my associate's degree, worked 2 jobs, and saved every penny. I moved into a slightly better apartment. I kept in touch with Tony, who was now a mechanic with a family of his own, and he became my sounding board, my reality check. "Are you sure you want to do this, Maya?" he'd ask. "You've built a life for yourself here." He was right. I had. A small, quiet life, but it was mine. But it was a life built on a foundation of unanswered questions. I couldn't move forward until I went back. The opportunity came in the form of an engraved invitation that Chloe sent to my P.O. box. Our parents' 25th wedding anniversary. They were throwing a party at the old house. "Everyone will be there," she wrote in a note attached to the invitation. "Please come. I need you to come." The stakes felt impossibly high. This wasn't just a party, it was a reckoning. Would I be welcomed? Ignored? Thrown out? Part of me was terrified, my stomach a knot of decade-old anxieties. But another part of me felt a grim determination. I spent weeks rehearsing what I would say. I practiced in front of my bathroom mirror, my voice shaking at first, then growing stronger. I had my questions lined up like soldiers, ready for battle. I had my hurt polished like a weapon. I had my ducks in a row, but my stomach still felt like a stone. The drive back to my hometown was surreal. The landscape was the same, but it felt different, like I was watching it through a stranger's eyes. As I pulled onto my old street, my heart started to pound a frantic, suffocating rhythm against my ribs. The house looked smaller than I remembered, but otherwise unchanged. There were cars lining the street, lights blazing from every window, the sound of music and laughter spilling out into the night. I parked a block away and walked, the cool night air doing little to calm my nerves. I could see shapes moving behind the windows, silhouettes of people I hadn't seen since I was a child. I reached the porch, the same porch I had walked away from 15 years ago, and I paused. The front door was ajar, a screen door separating me from the life inside. I was about to knock when I heard voices from the living room, sharp and clear. My mother and my brother. "You have to be calm tonight, James," my mother was saying, her voice tight with stress. "With everyone here." "Calm?" James's voice was ragged, angry. "She's coming, Mom. Chloe told me she invited her. What if she starts asking questions? What if she brings it all up again?" There was a pause. Then my mother's voice, lower, more desperate. "She won't. She can't. We'll handle it. But you cannot lose your temper. You know what happens when you do." Then James said the words that changed everything. The words that took the anger I had been aiming at my parents for 15 years and shifted its target completely. "I don't care," he snarled. "You can't let her in here. If she finds out what I really did that night, what this has all been about, everything falls apart. Everything we sacrificed her for will be for nothing." Sacrificed her for? What he really did? My anger, my carefully prepared speeches, my years of resentment toward my parents, it all evaporated in that instant, replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. The villain of my story wasn't who I thought it was. It had always been James. And my parents hadn't been the masterminds. They had been his accomplices. My hand dropped from the screen door. For a moment, I thought about turning around, getting in my car, and driving away forever. It would have been the easy thing to do, but I was so tired of doing the easy thing for them. I took a deep breath, pushed the screen door open, and stepped inside. The music and chatter in the living room died down as I entered. Heads turned, a sea of unfamiliar faces, and then the 3 that mattered. My mother's face went white. My father, standing by the fireplace, froze with a drink halfway to his lips. And James, he looked at me with a mixture of shock and pure, unadulterated fury. The silence stretched for a full 10 seconds. It felt like an hour. I walked toward them, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. I ignored the whispers, the confused looks from aunts and uncles and old family friends. I stopped a few feet in front of my parents, but my eyes were locked on my brother. "Why?" I asked. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the silence like a knife. My mother started to speak, the old, tired lines coming to her lips. "Maya, honey, this isn't the time. We were going through things." "No," I said, not taking my eyes off James. "I'm talking to him." I turned my full attention to my brother. "I heard you on the porch. What I really did that night. Everything we sacrificed her for. What did you do, James?" He just stared at me, his jaw clenched. My father stepped forward. "That's enough. You will not come into my house and make accusations." "Your house?" I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "This house stopped being mine a long time ago. The night you traded me to Mr. Harris to cover up whatever he did." I saw a flicker of shame in my father's eyes, but James was a statue of defiance. The social pressure, the fear, the shame, it all started to pour out of my mother in a torrent of excuses. They talked about the debt, how Mr. Harris had them in a corner. They talked about protecting the family name, about the fear of losing everything. It was a story of weakness, of parents who were too trapped and too cowardly to make the right choice. There were tears in my mother's eyes, but they didn't move me. Her apology, when it came, wasn't really an apology at all. "We thought it was for the best, Maya. We thought you'd be safer." "Safer?" I asked, my voice rising. "I was a child. You sent me to live with a stranger. You cut me off from everyone I knew and loved. You erased me from my own life. And for what? For him?" I pointed a trembling finger at James. "What did you do that was so terrible? It was worth sacrificing your own daughter." The room was dead silent. Every guest was frozen, watching this family drama unfold. I turned my gaze from my family to the crowd, to the jury of my relatives. And then I did something I hadn't planned. I spoke to the camera, to you. If you were me, standing in that room, looking at the faces of the people who threw you away to protect a secret, would you forgive? Or would you walk out that door and never look back? Let me know, because in that moment, I honestly didn't know the answer. A fragile, broken truce seemed to hang in the air. My parents looked defeated. James looked like he was about to explode. It felt like the end. But then, a small voice cut through the tension. It was Chloe. She had been standing by the staircase, silent, her face streaked with tears. "Stop," she whispered. Everyone turned to look at her. "Just stop lying." She looked at my parents, her eyes pleading. It wasn't just the money. That wasn't the real reason. She took a shaky breath, and her voice grew stronger, ringing with the clarity of a truth held in for too long. "Tell her," she said, her gaze landing on James. "Tell her about the accident." The word hung in the air. Accident. My father closed his eyes. My mother let out a small, wounded sound, like an animal. But James just stared at Chloe, his face a mask of cold fury. The story, the real story, finally came out. Not from James, but from my father, his voice heavy with a 15-year-old shame. The night before I was sent away, it hadn't been an argument that was the final straw. It was something else. James, who was 16 at the time, had taken our father's car without permission. He had been drinking with his friends. I, being 10 and idolizing my older brother, had begged him to let me come along for the ride. He'd stupidly agreed. On a dark country road, he was speeding, showing off. He lost control of the car and slammed into a tree. I was in the passenger seat. I hit my head, blacked out for a few seconds. I wasn't seriously injured, just bruised and terrified. But James, the golden boy, the star athlete with a bright future, had just committed a string of offenses. underage drinking, DUI, reckless driving, endangering a minor. A criminal record would have ruined his college prospects, his scholarships, everything my parents had pinned their hopes on. And that's where Mr. Harris came in. He wasn't just some guy my dad owed money to. He was a disgraced ex-cop who knew how to make problems disappear. The debt gave my parents leverage, but the accident gave them the motive. Mr. Harris made a call. He got the police report buried. He made sure James's name was kept out of it. But there was a price. 2 prices, actually. The first was the debt my father owed him, which would be considered paid in full. The second was me. I was the only witness, a traumatized, difficult child who might talk, who might not stick to the story. Mr. Harris's solution was simple: get rid of the witness. They would build a narrative that I was emotionally unstable, that the trauma of the minor fender bender had made me difficult to handle. Sending me away to live in a stable, quiet environment with him was presented as a therapeutic measure, a responsible parenting decision. It was a perfect, diabolical lie. My entire childhood, my label, my exile, it was all a cover-up. I wasn't abandoned. I was disposed of. I was the scapegoat, sacrificed on the altar of my brother's future. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I looked at James, at his handsome, successful face, a life built on my erasure. I looked at my parents, who had watched me leave, knowing the truth. They had chosen one child over the other. Something inside me snapped. The hurt, the sadness, the confusion, it all burned away, leaving behind a core of diamond-hard certainty. I was not a victim anymore. I was not their secret. "I see," I said, my voice eerily calm. "So this whole party, this anniversary, this house, it's all built on a lie." A lie that cost me my entire childhood. I turned and walked toward the door. My mother cried out my name. "Maya, wait! Where are you going?" I stopped, my hand on the doorknob, and looked back at them. "I'm going to go live my life, the one you stole from me. And you," I said, looking directly at James, "can live with what you did." I walked out the door, into the cool night air, feeling strangely light. I had done it. I had faced them. I had the truth. As I reached my car, my hand still shaking but my mind clear, my phone rang. I looked at the screen. It was an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was frail, panicked. It was one of my aunts. "Maya, oh thank God, you have to get to the hospital. It's your father. After you left, he collapsed. They think it's a heart attack." The world tilted. My newfound freedom, my righteous decision to walk away, was being tested. The universe was asking me, right now, are you really done? Or will you let them pull you back in one more time? For a long moment, I stood by my car, the phone pressed to my ear, listening to my aunt's frantic voice. The old Maya, the 10-year-old girl desperate for a crumb of affection, would have dropped everything and run to his side. But I wasn't her anymore. "Thank you for letting me know, Aunt Carol," I said, my voice steady. I'll be there when I can." I hung up before she could argue. I did not go to the hospital that night. I drove back to my apartment, the 3-hour journey a silent meditation on boundaries. I wasn't abandoning him. I was refusing to be emotionally blackmailed by a crisis of his own making. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of deliberate, focused rebuilding. I started by picking myself up, dusting myself off, and getting back in the game. My first call was to a therapist. I walked into her office, and for the first time, I told my entire story to someone who was paid to listen, to validate, to help me untangle the knots of trauma and neglect. It was excruciating, and it was liberating. My second call was to Tony. He listened to the whole sordid tale of the anniversary party without interruption. When I was finished, he just said, "Wow, well, his heart picked a dramatic time to give out." So, what's next for Maya, the unerased? His humor was a lifeline. I reconnected with the allies I had made. Chloe and I began a tentative correspondence. She was racked with guilt, but also liberated by the truth being out. She told me our father had survived. It was a minor heart attack brought on by stress. He was home now, recovering. She also told me the family was shattered. The party guests had left in stunned silence, and now the whispers I'd grown up with had turned into a roar. The perfect family facade had been blown to pieces. My biggest win came from an unexpected place. I took the story I had written in high school, the laminated sheet, and I expanded it. I wrote about the accident, about the lies, about the confrontation. I poured 15 years of silence onto the page. On a whim, I submitted it to a popular online magazine that featured personal essays. A month later, I got an email. They wanted to publish it. Seeing my story, my truth, out there in the world with my name on it was a reclaiming. It wasn't just my story anymore. It was a record. It was proof. The reconciliation with some parts of my family was slow and cautious. Chloe became a sister to me again, in a way she never had been before. We talked on the phone, met for coffee. We were two survivors of the same shipwreck, trying to piece together a raft. I visited my father once, at Chloe's urging. He was diminished, frailer. He looked at me with sad, tired eyes and whispered, "I'm sorry." It was a start, but it wasn't a cure. The chasm between us was too wide. With my mother and James, I established a permanent, unbreachable boundary. I blocked their numbers, I returned their letters, unopened. They were part of a past I was determined to move on from. The essay went live on a Tuesday. The response was overwhelming. Emails and comments from strangers who had felt erased, who had been the difficult child, who had survived their own family secrets. Their voices joined mine in a chorus of validation. Chloe told me that my mother and James had seen it. Their shame was now public record. A local bookstore that hosted a monthly storytelling night reached out. They had read my essay. They asked if I would be willing to read it live at their next event. This was it, the final step, to stand in front of a crowd of people and speak my truth out loud. I said yes. The night of the event, I was terrified. My hands were cold, my stomach in knots. Tony was in the front row, giving me a thumbs up. Chloe was there too, along with a few of my cousins who had reached out in support. As I waited backstage, my phone buzzed. A text from a number I didn't recognize. "We know you're there. Don't do this. Don't humiliate us anymore." I didn't need to ask who it was from, my mother or James. They were somewhere outside, watching, trying one last time to silence me. I took a deep breath. The host called my name. I walked out onto the small, brightly lit stage, my essay clutched in my trembling hand, and paused. For a second, I thought about walking away. I could bury it, pretend none of this ever happened, and go back to my quiet life. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I looked out at the supportive faces in the audience and at the dark windows of the bookstore, knowing my past was lurking just outside. Would I perform my truth, or would I let them bury it one last time? I stood at the podium, the single spotlight warm on my face. My heart was a drum against my ribs. I looked past the faces of my friends and cousins, out into the dark beyond the bookstore windows. They were out there somewhere, my mother and my brother, waiting, hoping I would fail, hoping I would retreat back into the silence they had created for me. I unfolded the pages in my hand. I didn't look at them. I knew the words by heart. They were etched onto my soul. I looked out at the crowd. "My name is Maya," I began, my voice clearer and stronger than I expected. And for most of my life, I was told a story about who I was. I was told I was difficult. I was told I was a problem. Tonight, I want to tell you a different story, the real one. And I did. I told them everything. I told them about the smell of beef stew and the sound of whispered arguments. I told them about a cheap suitcase and a door slamming shut. I spoke of a lonely room in a sterile house, of glossy photos that felt like knives, of a letter ripped to pieces by a man who told me to be grateful. I told them about the accident, the cover-up, and the brother whose future was built on the wreckage of my childhood. I didn't shout, I didn't cry. I just spoke my truth, raw and unvarnished. It wasn't for revenge, it wasn't to hurt them. It was for me. It was to take back the narrative of my own life. When I finished, the silence in the room was absolute. It was a heavy, profound silence, filled with the weight of everything I had just unpacked. Then someone started to clap, then another and another, until the whole room was filled with applause. It wasn't pitying applause, it was applause of recognition, of solidarity. I saw tears in the eyes of strangers. Tony was grinning from ear to ear. Chloe was openly weeping, but she was smiling through her tears. In that moment, I felt a release so complete, it was like a physical weight lifting off my shoulders. I had done it. I had taken their greatest weapon, the secret, and I had disarmed it by bringing it into the light. Afterward, as people came up to thank me, to share their own stories, Chloe hugged me tighter than she ever had before. "You were so brave," she whispered. "I'm so proud of you." I finally understood. My journey wasn't about getting an apology or forcing a reconciliation. It was about finding my own voice. It was about realizing that my worth was never determined by their acceptance. My final line to the audience that night, and my final line to you, is this: I didn't leave to hurt them. I left to find out who I was, and I did. Would you have gone back to that party? Would you be able to forgive any of them? Drop your story below. I read every single one. As I was packing up to leave, Chloe pressed a small, worn cardboard box into my hands. "I saved this for you," she said, her eyes serious. "I think you should have it now." I took it to my car. Under the dim glow of the streetlights, I lifted the lid. Inside, on top of a pile of yellowed, brittle envelopes, was a single folded piece of notebook paper with a faded unicorn sticker on the corner. It was the note she had slipped under my door all those years ago. And beneath it were dozens of other letters. Letters she had written to me over the years, filled with secrets and sisterhood that she had never been allowed to send. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning.